Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are, and welcome to K&L Gates Global Sports Law Symposium. Attendees will be in listen-only mode throughout the presentation, but you're encouraged to submit questions at any time by selecting the chat icon at the bottom of your screen and typing in your question. Questions will only be viewed by the panelists, and if your question is not addressed within our time available, you will be able to reach out to our panelists using the contact information on the follow-up email. This presentation is for informational purposes and does not contain or convey legal advice. The information herein should not be used or relied upon in regard to any particular facts or circumstances without first consulting a lawyer. And now I will turn it over to John Wilson, who is a partner in our Seattle office. John, you may now begin.
Thanks, Brooke. I appreciate the introduction and welcome everybody to our Global Sports Law Symposium. I am joined by my co-leader in the Global Sports Industry Group, Chris Round, who's joining us from Melbourne. Chris, thanks for waking up early. How are things in Melbourne?
Good. It's 0 degrees, or 32 as you'd call it. It's fresh.
Okay. So, we started this Global Sports Law Symposium during the COVID-19 pandemic. We wanted it to be, an informative gathering of people from throughout the world of sports to discuss, relevant and timely topics. And I'm really, really excited about the event that we put together today. Before we get too far into the program, I want to make sure to acknowledge and thank everybody who put a lot of hard work that goes into this. Even though it's only 3 hours, there is a lot that goes into putting together an event like this that goes, around the world with, multiple panelists and everything. So I'm very grateful for the efforts of my co-leader, Chris, and also really want to thank Karen Rojas. She's a senior market development manager who's been with us every step of the way. Brooke Erickson, who just read that perfect intro for us, and all of the tech folks behind the scenes who are helping us pull this off. So, as I said, I'm really excited for what we've got. We've got 4 really stellar panels on the agenda. We're going to start off with a panel on managing and mitigating risk through insurance. Our second panel is going to focus on transgender rights in sports. Third panel, we'll look at crypto and blockchain. And then our final panel is issues in sports administration, which is going to be moderated by Chris. So without any further ado, let's get started with our first panel. It's going to be moderated by Chris and my colleague, Jonathan Cohen, who's a partner in our Washington, D.C. office. His practice focuses on representing policyholders in insurance coverage matters, product liability matters, cyber events, supply chain issues. And interesting facts about Jonathan, in addition to his insurance practice, he attained a black belt in Taekwondo as an adult, and he also worked with Ruth Bader Ginsburg to help prepare her for her confirmation hearing to join the U.S. Supreme Court. So, Jonathan, the floor is all yours.
Well, thanks, John, and thanks, Chris, for inviting us. And I think we have a really exciting, really top-notch panel here to talk about what sports organizations need to know about insurance and risk management. As an initial matter, in our conversations preparing for today's panel, the panel really would like to invite audience members to send questions or topics that they're interested in particular, so that we can direct our comments to that. It's a very broad topic, particularly in the sports industry. And so there's a lot of different ways that we can approach it. And we want to make sure that if people in the audience have an interest in a particular angle, that we hit on that. So we have a really, as I say, a really deep and terrific panel, cross-border panel today. We have Alex Fairley, who is the Chief Executive Officer for the Fairley Group, which is really certainly among the leading risk consulting firms in North America in the sports and entertainment space. They focus on risk management and insurance for sports and entertainment clients. Alex has led the practice, which was formerly the National Sports and Entertainment and National Risk Consulting practices at Willis Towers Watson, which is one of the global brokers. He was there for 30 years. He's had more than 400 professional sports clubs as clients and numerous other clients in USOC governing bodies, collegiate athletic departments, really a who's who of media production clients in the entertainment space. We're very fortunate to have him with us today. We also have Todd Swanson, who's an executive vice president with Alex at the Fairley Group. He's been doing this for 35 years in the risk and management and insurance industry. He specializes in working with sports teams, leagues, stadiums in the United States. He's the senior account executive overseeing the NFL, MLB, and MLS insurance programs at the Fairley Group, and has extensive experience with things like new stadium construction and startup. Before joining Fairley Group in 2017, Todd was also with Willis leading their sports construction group. And then in addition to Todd and Alex, we've got James Davies coming out of the UK. James has worked as an insurance broker and risk manager in the specialist field of music and theater since 1992. In 2002, he founded the sports and entertainment broker, Longreach International, which expanded with the acquisition of theatrical specialist Walton and Parkinson and Atlanta-based sports specialist Essex in 2006 and 2010. In 2012, he formed the Entertainment Insurance Partners to acquire music specialist Robertson Taylor in the position of joint managing director. Until the end of 2000, James managed the UK sports and recreation team at Aon Risk Services, and he was really the driving force behind creating that new department. His work spans over numerous international entertainment events like the Ryder Cup, FIFA World Cup, New York Marathon, live music tours, film, TV productions, theatrical events. Again, we've got a really deep panel to talk with you about these issues. So today's topic is managing risk through insurance. And at the outset, I think it's really important to understand how risk management and insurance relate and how to think about insurance within a broader risk management strategy. We're really going to be talking a lot about this at a strategic level rather than talking about specifics that may be relevant to each country, but we really wanted to think at a strategic level. Insurance, when you think about it, is really intended to be the last line of defense, not the first. You want to really think about a very highly integrated risk strategy with risk avoidance as your first line of defense, claims management and indemnities. And finally, if all of that doesn't protect you, at that point, you may need to turn to your insurance. And part of the reason for that, and as the panel was talking in preparation for today, a lot of our conversation rested around how insurance can be imperfect as a solution, because sometimes insurance policies can imperfectly match a company's risk profile. Insurers sometimes resist coverage, claims can take a long time to resolve, it can be an expensive and difficult process. So thinking about insurance at the front end when you're dealing with risk management, it's important to see it as a piece of the puzzle, not the goal of the puzzle. And so again, when you're thinking about these issues, one of the places that I think we're going to talk about how to start is really trying to understand what risks you face. The more detail, the better. The more you can communicate with your risk professionals about the very specific things that you're trying to do, where you see the risks, the easier it is to take those risks and then match them against different types of protection, whether those are insurance or non-insurance vehicles, whether they're legal vehicles like contracts or indemnifications, or whether there are other risk management techniques. Sports organizations really start with the same sorts of general risks that affect most companies, things like property claims, cyber-related risks, workers' compensation, and employment issues, all of the same things that every company in the world really faces at some level. But then sports companies and organizations are different. They're entertainment companies. A lot of the risks that they face come out of their public-facing aspects. So sports companies and organizations are really unique. They have risks that are unique to the sports world. And today, we really have a panel of really, again, truly exceptional expertise in how to approach risk in sports and the entertainment world, how those things relate, in all of its complexity. So I wanted to start with a question for James. In our discussions, and as I mentioned a bit ago, we spent a lot of time talking about how helpful it is in thinking about risk and risk management for sports organizations as thinking about them as part of an entertainment kind of field, as entertainment companies. I'd really like to hear more from James as to how he thinks about that and how that might play into some of the things that you're doing.
Thank you. Well, actually, you sort of in my bio that you gave, Jonathan, I mean, the reason why we practice in a theatrical film and TV, music and sports arena is because we believe that all of that is entertainment. And so when we talk about insurance in that space, the underwriting or the risk takers of those events, whether it be music, theatre, film, TV, or sport, are all the same companies and normally the same underwriters. So we've seen from the clients that we work with that even though you've got maybe, I don't know, a golf event, the CEO of the tour will say that we're an entertainment company and we think that our players are entertainers, but they're not sports specialists, they're entertainers. They may be playing sport and it may be competitive, but we feel they're doing it for entertainment. So the way we look at risk management and the way that we look at insurance is first and foremost, nothing, and I think Alex will agree with this, is that nothing is off the shelf. So it's very limited to find an insurance policy that you would put in place for an event, whatever it might be, that you can just pull off the shelf and say, that fits the bill. Everything has to be tweaked or changed slightly, dependent on what the risk is. And similarly, with risk management, in particular outside of North America, because I know North America is stronger than certainly in Europe. There is a very it's confusing to a certain extent, but also it's difficult to comprehend why there are global events such as the FIFA World Cup or the Olympic Games or Cricket World Cup, and they move from territory to territory, and there isn't a risk management template that's transported per event. And that's something that we feel should change dramatically. I think that answers the question.
Yeah, no, thanks. Todd, when thinking about sports as entertainment, one of the things I know you focused a lot of attention on is stadium construction and management. How does that play into the risk strategy that a company might take?
Yeah, I mean, in the last decade or more, I've been involved in the, I think, around 15 stadium construction projects, and yeah, I mean, it's very challenging for a sports team to build for kind of a once in a lifetime project, a massive construction project, because in most cases that's not what they do, right? So I think in many ways they have to build a risk management function, for the purposes of this one project. And I think that's really, it's really where we have come into play and helping them do that. And because it's a massive undertaking, building, a $2 or $3 or $5 or $6 billion stadium, as the case may be, is very daunting. And so helping them walk through that has been it's been a real learning experience for us.
Yeah, and that dovetails a bit with the concept of entertainment because the stadiums can be used for all sorts of events, not necessarily just sporting events. So how does a sports organization that is either in ownership or owns the stadium, how do they deal with that kind of a situation?
Yeah, I mean, there's the construction phase that we have to work through, obviously, with the contractors, and then there's a transition that must occur of the stadium to operational, and that is not just a single day or a single week. That transition occurs over a period of time, typically several months, where you have both construction and operations going on at the same time within the venue, and then as construction completes, it becomes a fully operational stadium. But that presents itself a very challenging risk management scenario too, because you have not only do you initially have just this construction project, but then you have the construction and operations going on at the same time during that transitional period, and then of course we transition to full operations. So it's there's a lot going on there in terms of risk management. Requires a tremendous amount of coordination, and it's something that we've gotten very good at over the years, and certainly enjoy providing that to the clients. I do think I did want to comment a little bit on something you said earlier, Jonathan, about that insurance is just a piece of the puzzle of the broader of a broader risk management program, and I think that's really an important thing in our world of being a risk management consulting firm that also is an insurance broker. We live and breathe that every day, where insurance is a critical part of risk management, and yet it is, particularly with sports organizations, it is falling short of meeting, of fully protecting them. And in speaking about the U.S. liability insurance market, we have seen an erosion of the available coverage over the past decade, but probably even more so over the last 3 years. And along with that, a significant reduction in the number of insurers that are interested in writing sports organizations. And so that really was as a result of the historic frequency and severity of liability claims against sports teams and leagues. But some of those areas I think are potentially troubling, where liability insurance in the U.S. falls short of protecting that organization. And those areas include things like sexual abuse and molestation, which is typically excluded or severely restricted in general liability policies. Communicable disease is now almost always excluded from pretty much every relevant policy following the COVID pandemic. Concussion and head trauma is typically excluded from coverage, especially when insuring contact sports. There's a number of there is a way that we insure it through a very limited facility, but nevertheless, it's a critical exposure that is not fully insured. Sexual harassment or misconduct caused by a professional athlete is often excluded in management liability policies. Things like antitrust and unfair competition are also often excluded in management liability policies, and you can see why antitrust and unfair competition can be a very critical exposure. Breach of contract claims are almost always excluded from insurance. Another one, as respects insurance in the U.S., the most common way to purchase terrorism coverage is under the Terrorism Risk Insurance Act, or TRIA, but TRIA excludes terrorism caused by chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear materials. And you can see where that is something that's foreseeable, where a terrorist could use that type of a delivery mechanism for their terrorism. So you can see that that's kind of a troubling sort of an exclusion out of the government program TRIA. And then kind of back on that stadium or arena construction side, one of the things that we've seen recently is uninsured delays and cost overruns caused by labor shortages, and along with supply chain challenges and all of the COVID protocols that have had to take place, and as well as the cost inflation associated with material and labor inflation. But I think the most important and significant area which falls short, where insurance falls short, is in the area of just damage to a firm's reputation and brand. Most sports organizations today, their value is closely related to the brand, and so that is impacting. A hit to the brand can be a hit to the value of the organization, and then even beyond the economic value, many sports teams are owned by prestigious people or families who don't want their reputations tarnished by a highly public incident or lawsuit. I had dinner last week with the general counsel and chief operating officers from one of a large sports organization, and he indicated that that's one of the things that truly keeps him up at night is some sort of a highly public incident or lawsuit that causes some tarnishing or shame upon the ownership group, because they are such a family that is very proud of their reputation in the community. And so, I mean, the answer to all of that is risk mitigation, right? And in a number of areas, and we can talk a little bit more about that, if you'd like us to, in terms of what we see as those high-level best practices in the area of risk mitigation in sports.
Yeah, I think it probably would be good to turn to that. But before we turn to that, more on what insurance might be available for some of those things. I think the term, I can't remember who used it in our discussions before the panel, was not that the coverage is unavailable, but the match may be imperfect. Are there areas where audience members might think that less traditional forms of coverage might be important for them to obtain, or are there other forms of insurance or contracting protection that the audience might look to for some of these harder to insure risks?
Well, if I might jump in, a couple of things. One is, I mean, I understand what Todd was saying about the defamation or the infringement of copyright in the event of something going wrong for a high-end owner or a brand issue. I mean, that as a product is available in London, so that's something that we do get involved with. But obviously the most pressing thing that's happened in the last few years of our lives, everyone's lives, is COVID, and COVID remains pretty much unavailable everywhere as an insurance product, attaching to cancellation, abandonment, non-appearance, etc., of whomever for entertainment. However, I was very heavily involved in a government scheme to put together what would not dissimilar to TRIA, but for COVID, in the UK and in Germany. And fortunately or unfortunately, what we proposed is not what was agreed by the government. So it was bought and taken up, but it wasn't quite as successful as we hoped, because it wasn't quite as broad in coverage as we hoped. And I think that most of those schemes now are being pushed to one side by the various entities that were underwriting them, which is primarily governments across Europe. But one of the things that is now becoming quite clear is that there are entities, insurers and financiers who will look at short-term but very expensive risk-taking on COVID cancellation. But I would hasten to add, it's probably not worth it because it's so expensive.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I would agree that with some of the other risks that I had talked about, where your standard insurance falls short, there are some answers, some potential solutions, out there in the marketplace. But as James was speaking or saying, they're expensive, and in many ways, need to be carefully reviewed in terms of whether they are, viable. Sexual abuse and molestation, there is a separate a facility available. Beasley in London does offer sexual abuse and molestation coverage on a standalone policy. But the retentions are very significant. The premium is very significant, and the coverage is underwritten and in many ways tailored, carved back, as the case may be. So there are some answers out there, but I think they are need to be carefully reviewed. We do have concussion and head trauma coverage that's available for most of our clients through a facility that we have that's partly in the US and partly in London. That has proven to be very valuable for our clients, particularly in the contact sports space. So that is a reasonable solution, but it is, it's limited in terms of the number of players. So of course, we always are looking for new players in those areas. So again, there's some solutions there, but they need to be carefully reviewed and determine whether they're viable for a particular client.
Yeah. When did sexual abuse or head trauma exclusions come into coverage portfolios? And is there a lot of those kinds of claims are repetitive injuries over longer periods of time? So just like we do in other long tail product liability claims and the like, sometimes we've tried to look backward to older policies to be able to trigger coverage. Is that, I don't really have a sense, however, when those exclusions came into play in these different areas.
The sexual abuse and molestation exclusions really became in vogue just in the last 3 years, since the Me Too and all of the other very bad behavior and misconduct that occurred, and they entered the sports entertainment industry in a big way for that same reason. And I would say that was really 2 and 3 years ago. So very recently. Up to that point, we did not have them on most of our sports clients' general liability policies, but it pretty much they're ubiquitous at this point. So on the head trauma, concussion head trauma side, it's been around longer than that. Alex, you might even know more about the history there, but I'm going to guess it's been close to a decade that we've been dealing with the concussion head trauma exclusions.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I'd say they began going away a decade ago. It was kind of preceded, at least in North America, by the cumulative trauma benefit that players rushed to California to get, and then that led to head trauma issues. The issue itself has not become nearly the issue everyone was afraid of, but the insurance world treats it like the worst evil possibility in the world and just has run away from it. And yeah, that's been happening for a decade.
Yeah.
And just on my side in the UK, I have to say we're way behind the States on the head trauma front, although it's now becoming incredibly public. We have had in the last, we had one this weekend and one 2 weekends ago, rugby players, well-known, famous rugby players in their early 40s, who have now, we've now got 7 ex-professional rugby players, all in their early 40s, who have been certified with dementia due to head trauma. So there is now a lawsuit against World Rugby. So it's coming exactly the same thing that happened in the States is happening here now. We're starting at the professional level. I think there's a lot of trouble with kids in the States as well, playing, playing football and et cetera, et cetera. So there was issues with that, I think, as well. We haven't got to that point, although we have now banned, or they're banning heading a football or soccer ball for all kids under 10 years old. So it's happening here.
And
we could have an entire symposium on head trauma. I think it's a very complex issue, I think, and well, there's a lot to be learned about it, I think, yet.
yeah. And all of these issues implicate the interaction between the leagues, the teams, the players' associations. Thinking about it from a risk point of view and an insurance point of view, how do the different, I don't know what to call them, entities within that chain, how do they think, how should they think similarly? How should they think about these things differently?
That's a good-
You go,
Go
Alex.
ahead, James. No, go ahead.
No, after you, sir.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, it's a very good question. I don't think I've ever been asked that question. I'll tell you that, there's some reasons and some opportunities that they should be very together in their thinking. In fact, they should be collaborative and working together. We've been involved in, a couple of things where we have gathered up all of our clients, which are all the major league entities in the US, and said, you're all going to lose this battle if you don't all get together, because maybe what we were doing to manage risk in those cases were, leading an effort to get new laws passed in states or other places, and not a single entity was going to be able to do it by themselves. And so there's a lot of opportunities for them to work together, although that doesn't normally happen very naturally, at least in the US. They kind of, because there are also some differences. One obvious difference for head trauma is just the seriousness of the injuries. So for instance, we have big injuries in football. They're paid, it seems some days, to try to kill each other and cheered on to do it. And yet we see, our soccer or European football as, certainly there's a place for, head trauma is happening there, but it's far smaller, more frequent doses. And so, you deal with those things, very differently. So there's times they ought to be collaborating, and then there's times that they better be taking care of their business themselves, because what would happen in baseball, or, there's a lot of crossover happening these days in the area of training athletes and rehabbing athletes. And frankly, we believe that the Europeans are ahead of the North Americans, but we think the North Americans are kind of finally admitting it and figuring out, and we're seeing movement of expertise from Europe, into North America, into very old traditional places that do the same thing the same way forever. And owners are bringing people in who are upsetting the apple cart. And that's turns out to be pretty collaborative. And we're, bringing ideas about how to manage risk, across, oceans now. And so there's a lot of really great examples of when they can be collaborative, and times when it's, very different.
Yeah.
James, I don't know if that's where you're going. You probably can add to that.
James, go ahead. You had some comments on that.
I wholeheartedly agree with everything you just said, Alex. I mean, it's similar in the UK and in Europe, is that the big events, or the governing bodies, sporting governing bodies, have been doing this the same way for so many years. There's been very little change, and the change is being forced now. So they have to reflect, and they have to bring in specialists to help them, guide them through into this new era of what some people who are the old Blazer Brigade call the new world. And that's how the world is, and it's time to move on. And so yeah, we're seeing a lot of change, and there's a lot of differences. And just going back to that rugby head trauma thing, they felt that would just go away, but it's not. it's going to be very serious.
You know, head trauma really got heated up in North America because I won't name him, but a very well-known reporter for the New York Times began writing about it, and he was just brutally, you know, challenging. But I remember being at a league, a governor's meeting, literally, and getting up one morning, and there was a New York Times at my, you know, on the floor outside my hotel room, and the lead story was from this guy, and you know, we were there all together, and of course, you know, of course, they hated it. But the reality is this guy brought attention to something that was like really, you know, legitimately a problem, and that, you know, caused enough pressure and scurrying around that people started, you know, thinking about some different ways to do things. And so sometimes, unfortunately, the improvements we need, they come from us not taking, you know, the best care of ourselves. And while we don't like the criticism, sometimes it brings, you know, really needed and productive change. And I would say all the best improvements, none of them had to do with insurance. And what insurance says in those times is, let's exclude that. Like, we're not gonna have anything to do with that. So clients usually have to, you know, the very toughest risks, carriers separate themselves from it by either excluding it or putting big deductibles on it, which essentially says, you know, like, you keep it. And so entities have to figure out how to manage it themselves. And, you know, Todd alluded to it, and, you know, James alluded, and John, you alluded to it in your intro. Like, you got to get insurance right, and it's hard, and it's challenging, and you better have good people, and they better be incredible negotiators. And, you know, but when you get to the very, very best place it can be, it's painfully short. If for no other reason, because carriers just say, I'm not even covering that. Like, deal with it on your own. You got to figure out how to, you know, manage your risk, you know, yourself. And if you don't wake up with that mindset, and I would say it's been the biggest challenge of our practice and people like James is, over the last 2 decades, getting people to quit thinking, just buy some insurance, and get them to think, like, practically, okay, what are we going to do about, like, okay, a lot of guys are hurt, and a lot of guys have dementia, and a lot of guys, when they turn 55, can't remember their girlfriend's phone number. So, you know, what are we going to do about it? And there's really a lot of amazing progress that gets made when people, you know, kind of start thinking like that. And, you know, we say to our client, we frankly help them buy less insurance. We help them buy things that cover really only things that they just can't live through. Like, if a plane full of athletes crashes, then we need to cover that. And we can't control it, and that's disastrous. But if a lot of guys are getting head trauma, you know, because the way we do things or treat people or put people back in games anyway, or, you know, kind of ignore them because the coach wants them back out there, then, you know, all that stuff we can manage, you know, better alongside our clients ourselves.
Yeah, I'm
okay.
go ahead. Sorry.
No, please.
I was just going to say, I'm not real sure if, you know, what came first there. Did, you know, our recognition and the client's recognition of their ability to better manage it themselves, or, you know, some of these risks, or the insurance industry wasn't willing to insure some of them. So, which is probably more likely. And by necessity, they had to be managed. And I think that's really where we, you know, feel is our strength is helping sports organizations understand the importance of risk management and managing those risks, and then how to do it, you know, in those areas. I said earlier that some kind of best practice areas that we could talk about, and, you know, one of those is our strong belief that, you know, it starts with excellent policies and procedures, you know, in a host of areas, you know, including concussion management, you know, but as well as things like youth programs, because that is a huge exposure for a lot of sports organizations, is their youth program, you know, as well as things like security and law enforcement, crowd control, recently there was a horrible event in Houston with, where crowd control was a critical issue. Cybersecurity is a critical issue these days because obviously with all of the ransomware and cyber attacks that have taken place. And I would also add emergency procedures around things like severe weather and active assailant incidents. So policies and procedures is really a critical part of risk management, and I think it kind of factors into that concussion management discussion that is so critical to managing the head trauma exposure.
Yeah, and there's very much a push and pull in this, similar to the way that warfare has a push and pull where offensive weapons get developed and then defensive weapons get developed and get ahead of the offense. And so new kinds of claims come up. Policyholder lawyers find new and creative arguments to try to get them covered, and then insurers find new arguments to try to avoid them. And that kind of push and pull is an evolution that affects how the policies look, how other forms of risk management may need to be addressed. One of the questions that we've received is about COVID-19, and that's a perfect example of what I'm talking about, where we've had a lot of success under recovering under event cancellation policies that's often had microbiological coverages expressly included. But insurers really drew the line and refused to pay under traditional all-risk property policies, and litigation has been very rampant, at least in the United States and to a lesser extent in the UK and around the world, over whether those policies cover. And the jury, excuse the pun, is still out on what the answer will be. Although the insurers have had a lot of success, there have been some cases that have been policyholder favorable, and there are a lot of cases that are still out there. And so, it goes right back, Todd, to where you were talking about at the early part of our conversation about thinking about where risks might lie, thinking about where methods that may go beyond insurance may be available to first protect against the incident ever arising, and then to figure out how to mitigate those risks through the kinds of tools that we have at our disposal. So we're very close to out of time. Is there anything that we haven't talked about that each of you might think would be useful to this audience?
I think it's something you mentioned right at the start, Jonathan, which as soon as you said it, I sort of disagreed. But I haven't said that yet. Now I have. So it's, insurance is obviously generally used as a tool to put you back in the position you would have been in if something goes horribly wrong or you are sued. But also insurance in sport and entertainment is very much used to help finance events as well. Securing finance, securing sponsors in order to finance the event, to put the event on. So, I mean, it's used at both ends of the event in my side of things.
Well,
Agree, James. Another example of that is where it's used to ensure these guys contracts with these owners, so that they can give them these guaranteed contracts. I agree. There's a lot of good places for it. So
yeah,
It's a huge part of risk management, and not just risk management, but like you say, facilitating events and making things happen. Someone I knew a long time ago used to say insurance is the DNA of capitalism, because nothing happens without insurance, and so there's a lot of truth to that. But I do believe in many ways too with the sports industry, there's a need for an alternative because of where insurance is falling short.
And I would say fundamentally what insurance is at the end of the day is a vehicle to lower transaction costs, to allow entities and people to do things they might not otherwise be able to do from a risk point of view. And so where it can be used for that more effectively, it's a very effective vehicle. Well, I think we're out of time. I want to thank the panelists for what I think was a really great discussion. And thanks again for joining us. And let me turn it back over to John.
Thank you, guys.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jonathan, Alex, Todd, James. That was a very informative discussion about some of the unique risks presented in the context of sports. So really appreciate all of you joining for our Sports Law Symposium. So for our third panel, we're going to turn to crypto and blockchain. And I'm pleased to introduce my colleague, Drew Hinkies, as our panel moderator. Drew is a partner in our Miami office, where his practice focuses on digital assets, blockchain, smart contracts, and how those technologies interact with existing laws and regulations and how they impact legal relationships. Beyond his practice at K&L Gates, Drew serves as an adjunct professor at NYU's Law and Stern Business School. He was previously recognized as one of CoinDesk's most influential people in blockchain. And incredibly, he was a contestant on MTV's Wanna Be a VJ contest in 1998, which is amazing. Drew, I'm not sure how you follow up on that, but I will turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, John. Just want to test to make sure that my audio is coming through okay. Can everybody hear me? Wonderful. Well, VJing didn't work out, but consolation prize as a lawyer is every once in a while I get to host and moderate panels. So thanks so much for having me, and thanks to everyone who's been joining the program so far. As John suggested, I'm a partner at K&L Gates Miami. I teach at NYU. And since 2018, I've been teaching a class that's called Digital Assets, Blockchains, and the Future of Financial Services. And it's been a lot of fun to teach both law students and business students who want to learn and understand a little bit more about blockchain, smart contracts, NFTs, and all the other fun things that we're going to talk about today. I'm delighted to host this panel, and I'm joined by two distinguished panelists who will share their perspective as well as those of their organizations about how digital assets like NFTs are going to impact the sports industry and help bring sports closer to the fans. First, and apologies if I butcher anybody's names here, I'd like to introduce Abi Arunchalam as how did I do, Abi? All right. So as a senior commercial advisor for Cricket Australia, the peak national sporting body that administers cricket in Australia, Abi focuses on commercializing Australian cricket's content and intellectual property across the globe. While this involves monetizing more than traditional media channels like TV, video streaming, and radio, Abi and his team also stay close to innovations in the digital and technology space that could be complementary or potentially disruptive to existing broadcast models. The most recent digital frontier that Abi has conquered is the soon-to-be-launched NFT program of Australian cricket, and I assure you that we're going to hear a lot about that in short order. Our second panelist is Mark Seal. Mark is the CEO of Sortium, and he comes from an extensive background in sports and entertainment NFTs, pioneering the TOPS NFT platform and introducing brands such as Major League Baseball, Bundesliga, UEFA, and Godzilla, among others, to Web3. He has since co-founded Sortium, building technology to further revolutionize the NFT space, as well as provide thought leadership to those building on digital assets for the future of interactive Web3 sports and media experiences. So now that we have a little bit of a sense of who we are, I'm going to start with some basic level setting. I have the exciting and perhaps unenviable task of explaining Bitcoin, crypto, blockchain, smart contracts, and NFTs to a bunch of lawyers in 10 minutes. So everybody wish me luck. First, let's start with blockchains. Blockchains are networks of computers that run compatible software that allow them to collectively maintain a record set. We call that set of records the ledger, which tracks which user of the blockchain software controls what asset. The assets we usually think about are called coins. In the Bitcoin system, for instance, the assets are called Bitcoins. In Ethereum, they're called Ether, and so on. When a user using one of these systems wants to transfer a coin to another user, those users get together and create a message that gets sent to the network asking for those computers to approve the transfer. The computers will then undergo a process called reaching consensus or agreeing on any request to change the records that are maintained by that ledger to basically reflect an update. That update might be Abi just sent a Bitcoin to Mark. They do this generally using one of two technical procedures. Generally, it's either proof of work or proof of stake consensus. And I won't get into the details of this. Suffice to say that all the computers that maintain the record set have to agree that the transaction occurred for it to occur. When they all agree and reach consensus, They will update their ledgers to reflect the new state of the records. That is, Abi has one fewer Bitcoin, Mark has one more, and that definitively changes who controls what. Blockchains use this collective consensus to determine when a transfer occurs, rather than relying on a traditional third party like a bank or like a securities clearinghouse in order to confirm when a transaction or a transfer is actually settled. That's the secret sauce. That's what makes blockchains interesting. Now, the assets that are tracked on blockchains, which I've called coins, they're all digital, they're all intangible. You can't hold them in your hand. You can't transfer them to anybody else in a different way. They only exist in the context of the system. However, we're talking about these things not because they're interesting, but because a lot of them have material real-life value. All blockchain systems do different things, but they exist to track and facilitate transfers of assets from one user to another. Some of them build on top of that basic core service and provide something called smart contracts. Smart contracts are the ability to embed some logic to determine when a transfer occurs. An example would be if the score of the soccer match goes over 5 goals, let's send value to Abi. If it's under, let's send value to Mark. If there's a technology service that can provide the information necessary for the contract to execute, the code will decide whether to effectuate the transfer or not. Smart contracts built on top of blockchains can be used to automate transactions like we discussed, but they can also be used to build more complex software as well. The best known blockchain that includes smart contracts is Ethereum. Ethereum basically built a full service computer on top of a blockchain. And so its basic functionality is it can transfer assets from A to B. Its additional functionality, smart contracts, means you can build software that determines under what circumstances a transfer goes from A to B. Ethereum also allows its users to make new assets that use the Ethereum blockchain and all of its infrastructure. That means that anybody can quickly create a new asset without having to build out a new blockchain, new wallets, and so forth. They don't have to go and recruit new people to support their network. They can simply leverage what Ethereum has already created. Ethereum went further and created specifications that make it very easy to create new assets. A specification called ERC20 makes it easy to issue what we call fungible tokens. Anybody listening in right now, with a little bit of help, can create their own asset on top of Ethereum in about 15 minutes. That easy. Fungible tokens, like the ones created by ERC20, are tokens that are interchangeable for one another. An ERC20 token can be used the same way that any other ERC20 token can be used. The easy creation of new assets and the low barriers to entry fueled the ICO craze of 2016 to 19 and led to tons of money and interest flooding into the crypto arena. Ethereum also supports a specification called ERC 721, which allows the creation of non-fungible tokens or NFTs. These tokens are unique and they're distinguishable from other tokens in that they're traceable from their creation through each transaction to a different user to the current holder. They're not interchangeable with other tokens. And these unique digital assets are what we're going to be discussing today. The NFT protocol was designed to include in the digital asset the place to put a reference to another asset on another system. These other assets might be a picture, a video, a song, or some data that makes sense when interpreted on another platform like a gaming platform. These NFTs have allowed creators to offer unique digital experiences and assets associated with unique visual assets as a way of reaching out to fans, to create in-game items that can be controlled outside of the game environment and so on. NFTs can also be used as unique identifiers and can be associated with digital tickets or badging or community membership. And unlike fungible tokens, NFTs are a much better fit for systems that seek to use digital assets to represent unique items like land title registries. The list of use cases goes on and on and on. Our panelists here today are going to talk about how they've used these sorts of digital assets like NFTs to create new value, new experiences, new communities, and new opportunities for sports leagues and for sports adjacent businesses. I guess I'll start here with Abi. Maybe you can start us off with a little bit of a discussion about how Cricket Australia is thinking about these new assets and that new NFT program that I sort of teased at the beginning of the talk here.
Yeah, no problems, Drew. Thank you for setting the scene. It's always an unenviable task to try and capture the entirety of the technology that goes into these sort of programs. And what hopefully people heard is that there's quite an extensive way it can be used, and it can get quite technical. So the challenge for us as a sport was, well, how do you take the benefits of that technology, but then apply it to our fans in a simplistic way, or apply it to our business in a simplistic way that isn't a barrier to adoption? So we actually started with, whilst the tech was getting a lot of momentum, and other sports like the NBA had made a bit of a splash in this area, we started with, well, why do we want to like sort of engage this technology or use this technology as a business at this point in time? And it sort of stems from the fact that cricket's arguably the second most popular global sport, and it has a very sort of diverse fan base that's placed all around the globe, and a heavy concentration in the subcontinent. So it's actually quite a high cost exercise as Australian cricket to sort of engage or monetize those fans outside of Australia. And traditional media models or traditional asset models require sort of high cost activities or supply chains, or engagement with people that are established in those jurisdictions in order to be able to actually properly engage with those fans. And what NFTs allow are an effectively borderless fan engagement tool that's like exceptionally low cost in a relative sense to activate a large number of users, whilst also being in the zeitgeist of society, and letting people sort of be on the edge of or the digital frontier of sport and fan engagement intersecting. So it ticked a lot of boxes from that perspective. And also what we got as a sporting organisation was the ability to have a direct conversation with our fans. So we've historically always relied on intermediaries, be it the TV broadcaster, be it the actual clubs or the teams themselves, in order to have sort of more direct conversations with our fans. And it was very attractive as a national sporting body to be able to start almost literally chatting with someone in India, or chatting with someone in America on a one-to-one basis, and the potential for that relationship to be sort of groomed and made into something that can be long-lasting and open up other avenues was quite attractive. So they're the sort of 10,000-foot view of why we engage in this space, and I assume we'll get into more detail, but I might throw it back to you and see which way you wanted to take the chat before I sort of bore everyone for the next half an hour.
And nothing boring about it. I think that you've identified very clearly why NFTs and how NFTs can be used in order to reach an audience. Maybe Mark, you want to talk a little bit about your experience with your current and your prior positions in the NFT world in sports, and sort of build upon Avi's comments.
Yeah, absolutely. I think first, just want to double check that everybody can hear me all right, and then perfect. So I spent a lot of time early on building the Topps NFT platform and their strategy around NFT approach for Major League Baseball, Bundesliga, UEFA, as you said when we started. Um, for a company like Topps, the value is pretty obvious, right? You can almost add tangibility to an intangible object, a digital object and that's kind of the best way I message it to somebody who just doesn't understand it at all. Digital objects are not tangible, but imagine if you could add the most tangibleness to that object. That's what an NFT really represents. It's your ownership over that. So for Topps that already had a digital collectibles business and wanted to elevate that business, NFTs are a natural evolution of what a digital collectible can be. And now my goal at Sortium, and why we started Sortium really in the first place, is we see a lot of value in collectibles just as a raw collectible. I mean, I'm a collector myself, whether you talk about digital trading cards or physical trading cards or Magic the Gathering or Funko Pops or sneakers, whatever it is you collect, right? Collectors are collectors. There doesn't necessarily have to be a utility, but I think some of the power of Web3 technology is that you can add utility and engagement around these digital assets that can bring the fan base and the user base that love these properties. You can bring them closer. And in many ways now we have a way to give people a little bit of ownership over the things that they love, over the properties and IPs that they love so dearly. there's a way to do this through the utilization of Web3, and even something we haven't talked about and may not dive into in this conversation through DAOs, which is a decentralized autonomous organization. Sortium, our goal is to kind of blend all of these Web3 technologies together to create really innovative experiences. We've built something that we call a Web3 experience engine that helps facilitate deep tokenization of whether it's collectibles or video games or experiences in general, whether it's art, music, etc., and really focus on bringing the fans closer to the properties that they love. And that's something Topps has always done really well, just as a general business. And that was the focus when we started to engage with Major League Baseball and these other sports leagues and teams. Is how do we get people to feel like they own a piece of what they love?
So, Avi, how do you?
Well, with a lot of research. So we started out setting out to create this program in March of 2021, and we thought we'd be done and dusted by sort of May of 2021 and wrapped it up and let it go. And what we found was it actually took about 13 months to actually establish our program in order to do it in a way that was meaningful to our fans, but also in a way that captures the extreme pace at which this industry or Web3 as a concept moves. So that traditional sporting bodies don't move that nimbly and aren't necessarily built to move in such a nimble fashion. So one of the first things we did was we realized that we needed expert advice and we need to partner with brands that are doing this in a way that resonates with cricket. So we ultimately onboarded two partners in order to help us execute our program, which is Rario, who launched the first cricket NFT program, and Australia is, Cricket Australia is one of the first national sporting bodies to jump on with them, and Block Trust, who are a Web3 experiential / marketing / innovation company, if we can call it that. So that they complement each other quite nicely and sort of tick the box from a Cricket Australia perspective quite well. So we sort of realized there was a knowledge gap. We worked for 13 months to try and learn as much about this space as we can. Never a good idea to try and commercialize something and learn about something at the same time, but we eventually got there in 13 months. Two other elements are we partnered with our players union in order to execute this program. So to Mark's point, I mean, he hit some of the high notes of all the discussions we had in the 13 months, right? Like bring the fan closer to the game, let them own their own piece of cricket, sort of stoke the emotional connection. Like these were all goals that we had as part of our process. And what we realized is whilst people love the sport, generally people engage with players or heroes or have emotional connection with the athletes that participate. So it was really important for us to be able to have meaningful utilities or meaningful avenues of engagement via these NFTs. We need to have our players on board as well. So we worked in partnership with our players union in order to execute this. And that in and of itself brings new difficulties and challenges because most models are 30 to 50 years settled around how players get paid and what collective bargaining agreements say, et cetera. But credit to them, they were really keen to embrace this space to allow cricket in Australia, at least, to be sort of at the frontier when it comes to NFT programs. So tech partners, player partners, and then the final step was we actually realized that a lot of people don't want to embrace this space. So whilst there is a very young skewing audience and a tech skewing audience that's exceptionally attractive to us as a ongoing proposition when it comes to sort of them engaging with cricket, especially the way we see this tech moving forward, we also have a very rusted on sort of silver haired community that does not want to hear a single word that is different to the way they've heard about cricket in the last 50 to 70 years. So we were really conscious that whatever we did must not change their experience. So we actually will be executing our program and / have set up our program to be able to be completely ignored if you want to, and you can engage with cricket in the exact same way you have for the last 70 years, or if you want to go down the rabbit hole, you can come on us, come on the journey with us, and explore this Web3 metaverse slash universe slash question mark with us as we sort of feel it out over the next. We have sort of a 5-year horizon at the moment, but we think this is a long-term play and potentially quite disruptive to the overall model of how sports engage with fans.
So extremely interesting, Avi, and there's a number of points that I would love to hear a little bit more about, but maybe I want to take one thing that you mentioned and turn it over to Mark for his feedback here. Avi mentioned that there are certain folks who he expected would be fully embracing of new technology as a way of interacting with something familiar and beloved, and that there would be a certain sport fan that does not want to see anything change. Is this something that's unique to cricket or something that you've seen across the sporting world? That's the first half of the question. And the second half of the question is, do we think that this is something that is part of a bigger issue, or do we think that it's simply we haven't figured out the right way to use the technology to really grab the fan?
So I think fan engagement, anytime you're introducing anything new, right? And this kind of goes broad spectrum for whether it's sports, entertainment. If you implement new monetization models or you implement new technology models that are supposed to be a kind of differentiator, productization of something, you're always going to get some pushback, right? Fans love what they love, and most people don't like change. Some people are willing to embrace change, but when they think it puts at risk the things that they already love and have grown to an attachment to, you always get a level of pushback. I think that's natural and normal in any industry that has a fan base. Where this differs maybe slightly is there's so many projects out there in Web3 that come off as gimmicky or almost I'll stick with the word gimmicky, but I think everybody listening knows some of the kind of pitfalls of how Web3 can be perceived. And a lot of that has to come, or a lot of that comes from the level of immaturity of implementation of the technology. When we look at Web3, what that even is, and I'll give the very, very quick, like 10 cents of what Web3 even means, because I think most people have no idea what that even means. You say Web3, that there's no definition. But if we go back to Web 1, Web 1 was effectively the read access of the internet. It was mostly utilized by institutions. They would post articles, post papers. You could consume those articles. That's it. Web 2 is the evolution to read-write access. You have beginnings of social media. You have the beginnings of read-write into the internet space. And now you can push information and pull information as needed. Web 3 is really the transition of corporate-owned networking infrastructure to decentrally owned networking infrastructure by the users, and how they can capture the upside of that network infrastructure. That's the intent of Web3, right? So if you look at each subcomponent of Web3, NFTs, blockchain, DAOs, combined, that's facilitating user-owned experiences. That is the simplest understanding of what Web3 even is. So the way that it's being presented to fan bases today is in many ways coming off as cash grabs, right? And they see this and they're not being presented or being taught that what they're being given is ownership over their beloved franchises and sports leagues. They're rather being presented as, here's a thing that you're supposed to feel is valuable, but we haven't told you why. And we haven't actually presented a reason why. That's where I think some of the pushback comes from. As we continue to mature in the space and the implementation of this foundational technology matures, then I think it's going to be easier for a consumer to understand why they want to be involved in Web3. And in many ways, the content that they're already consuming, the digital content that they effectively might throw away money on, will hold some value to them. They'll begin to understand that, oh, these things that I love anyway, that 5 years ago I was buying, but I had no expectation of return on my investment or value. There's going to be some opportunity to capture that value and trust in the decentralization of ownership around those assets, and in turn the properties that people are engaging with.
Bobby, is this the strategy for Cricket Australia?
Yeah, 100%. I think that you termed it user-owned experiences, Mark. What we sort of, our marketing people have framed that as is community building. So what we effectively are looking to build is a giant echo chamber of cricket fans talking about cricket, saying how much they love cricket. So it's really, there's no real recipe for disaster there, and that's why, like a lot of NFT projects, whilst they might hold value for Mark, they might not hold value for you, Drew, but just because Mark engages with the sort of community aspect of that project in particular. And that's why we see sort of huge variations in value. The challenge is, I think, timing is one of the hardest things that we're engaging with at the moment. And cash grabs is a great word. It's one that we've, great term rather, it's one that we've been very conscious to avoid. Mainly because there's been a flood of there's been a flood across the whole spectrum of programs. So literally sort of fraudulent, trying to take your money for no absolute reason, all the way through to providing genuine utility, genuine engagement, and genuine community for people that engage for high levels of cost. So what we're hypothesizing is that you need a suite of products when you launch NFT programs now as a sport. So you have the sort of high volume, low cost play that can just facilitate what has been established in the market already, e.g. NBA Top Shot. And then you need a more sort of premium, but that's not premium in relation to cost or profitability. It's premium in relation to what the value is to the person that is engaging with that product, in order to satisfy people or fans that you are not just in this for the money. So what we would term as premium products would be sort of partnering things with in real life experiences in our existing ecosystem, because ultimately we're in the business of putting cricket matches on, and we want people to engage with those cricket matches more. So if you want to meet the Australian Test cricket captain, maybe one of the avenues you can do that is to purchase this one large NFT or this one large package. And this is just a avenue that facilitates that to happen, as opposed to being about the monetization of the NFT itself. But equally, we'll complement that with trading cards that go into a fantasy game or that go into any other gaming that you can purchase and engage with if that takes your fancy. So I'd be lying if I said we'd cracked it. We think this is a test and learn space, but we have acknowledged that this is not a one size fits all space. And I think one of the other points I'd say to Mark is, on the back of what Mark was saying, was he was talking about sort of horizons and how he sees this evolving. What we think could happen fairly quickly, given the pace at which this industry moves, is the technology will go into the background and people will engage with these products, but they won't even know they're engaging with Web3 or NFTs. And that's where we think that the holy grail of this space is, because it's reducing costs for execution. It allows us to do a lot more, but people won't even know that they need to do different things. It'll just be sort of fed to them seamlessly. And that's when we think we can also take it to other business applications a bit more seamlessly as well.
I think, though, the technology being in the background is a necessity, right? It has to develop that way. It's not. So I think that's a great point, because anybody who believes it's going to be in your face for the foreseeable future, just look at any technology basis that we've ever had. Just look at websites. Websites are just a component now of almost any internet-based business. Nobody evaluates a website as in your face. It's just web and internet infrastructure facilitating the business goals. It's not going to be any different for Web3 into the future. You're going to engage with it on your phone, on your laptop, on your TV, on any device you may have. You're going to begin to interact with these decentralized networks and the underlying architecture. You're never going to know. And the same way that you wouldn't look into a business that is web-based and start asking them about what web infrastructure they're using, what platforms they're using, what underlying technology they're using, unless you're specifically interested in that, right? But the same way you wouldn't over-evaluate a web-based company today, you're not going to over-evaluate a Web3 based company tomorrow.
So I think we all agree that we use the web without worrying exactly what type of Apache server a given website is using, or which version of HTTP the website was initially written upon, because it simply doesn't matter. The point is, what do you get when you use it? What is the experience like? And in many cases, like within social media, how are we using this as a communicative or expressive medium? When we can communicate and express ourselves is when we find ourselves using things over and over. So zooming out from the technology, and perhaps I went a little too heavy-handed with the tech at the beginning, I guess the better question is, what's the experience supposed to be for those that use NFTs?
It depends on, I think, the experience that you want to build. It depends on the fan base. Knowing your target audience is key. I wouldn't build a strategy game for people who love action sports, right? They want to be in it. They want to feel like they're a part of the experience. So if we were to build a video game, for instance, in the sports segment, and we wanted to build a game that was more similar to FIFA, and that's our target audience, well, build them that and tokenize that game process, tokenize the actions in the game, tokenize how the players can be NFTs, of course, they can be collectibles in that regard and utilized in that game or others, but don't build them a card game because that's not the experience that fan base is after. So I think knowing your user base, knowing your demographics is just as important in Web3, if not more important, than any traditional business segment, whether it's a trading card game or a collectibles product or a video game product. You need to know who's going to consume it, and you should build the experience for those people. But ultimately, the experience should be enjoyable, right? Know your audience, build something enjoyable, and let the underlying Web3 infrastructure provide the value on top of underneath the experience layer.
Mark's made that sound very simple as concepts in order to execute the programs. I think I agree with everything he said. That I think the challenge when you come like sitting in a national sporting organisation, the difficulty of that challenge gets magnified when like know your audience is a very important statement, but what we know is we have a very diverse audience, and what we don't know is how that diverse audience engages with Web3. So we know how they engage with watching cricket on TV or engaging with our digital channels, but we're not quite as detailed as we need to be or can be eventually on how they engage with Web3. So what we said is, well, if we are trying to ensure adoption or ensure engagement with this new play that we're making, what we need to do is take things that are valuable in our existing ecosystem that we know people love and somehow bridge the gap with the NFT program that we're looking to launch, so that what people will see is the hero is things that they love already, but the NFT just allows us to do it. So meet and greets with players, money can't buy experiences in stadiums, masterclasses online for people that aren't in Australia, flying people from point A to B, getting reciprocal access to cricket in their country, or so things that are probably the reason why they've come and sought out our program as a starting point, slash things that we want to make available for people that aren't Web3 natives or that aren't engaged with NFT programs, give them a reason to actually come to our program. Because what we found is, whilst there is quite a heavy investment skew or a speculative skew to existing Web3 and NFT program users, it's very hard to tailor utilities and experiences for them if they're just looking for a quick buck. So that doesn't ensure longevity of your program. So if you sort of design it for longevity, then the investors will either support you or they'll find a way to monetize it, or they won't. But that's okay, because you're talking to a larger sort of cricket engaged fan base, and you're building this for 5 years, not for 5 minutes. Once again, it is that divide is very hard to call at a given point in time, though, because ultimately, if you go too far either way, you might not have critical mass of people that are engaging with it to ensure you have momentum to your program, and things live or die by momentum, not necessarily by the goodness of the idea that they're representing.
So since we've talked about, I guess, how NFTs started, how they have been used, and how we see them being used now, gazing into our collective crystal balls, what do we see as the future for NFTs in sports? And I'll hint at a path that I'd like you to take. There's been a lot of discussion about community and about DAOs. Any thoughts as to how we see NFTs moving forward?
Yeah. So I think if we're looking at it from the perspective of a DAO, and what a DAO really offers is organized structure that's community owned. And that could be achieved and applied in a number of ways. It can be fan clubs that are community owned. It could be the actual teams that become decentrally owned. And as part owner of a team, you get certain benefits, and your percentage of ownership gives you certain voting rights for what that team may do, or may, how they build their brand and represent themselves. And that will be agnostic to the actual sport. I think you'll see that occur and be applied. I don't know how quickly we'll see it applied in some major sports, but I can certainly see in smaller leagues that being adopted quickly. I think in esports that'll be adopted relatively quickly, and over time that will begin to work its way through, because that's a way to give direct user and community ownership into what they love, right? The teams are what they love. The sports are what they love. So if you can have a little piece of that, and that could be something as simple as the owner of a team providing a 10% globalized stake that's fractionalized across any number of fans, right? It's not like the whole team has to be a DAO, but a percentage of it could be. And they can make decisions on how that team moves forward based on that. It could even be voting on licensing agreements. I think the licensing space in sports and Web3 is really new, and it's being approached a bit differently. So all ways that I see the space evolving around DAOs, but would love to hear an additional opinion.
Bobby, is Cricket Australia going to form a DAO?
Never say never, Drew, but not in the short term plan. But I think DAOs is an interesting term, right? Like it's you can actually do it relatively easily if the decisions that you're allowing it to make are insignificant. But if you want the decisions and the engagement to be significant or meaningful, then I think it takes time for sporting organisations to get on board with that. And that's probably where our crystal ball sort of pointed. It's how much sort of significance do you put in this space, and how quickly is the overarching question that we have to ask ourselves. So the challenge, we think, is we have sort of assets and IP that people want to engage with, and they want to participate in, they want to own, but you can't really do that to the exclusion of others, because they also want to engage with those assets and that IP, and they have previously, and they've shown us loyalty, and they'll continue to show us loyalty. So we can't see this as a replacement yet. So we don't think it's all chips in on Web3 and DAOs and communities, and we will self-sustain off this new community. We think of it as complementary at the moment. So what we start to do is make sure that some premium things that we've historically done, we will only do via our NFT program. Be it some sort of money can't buy experiences, be a commentator in a game for a day, or sort of any new experiences that we come up with, maybe the only avenue to access it is via our NFT program. So we sort of force engagement, or at least force interest into that. And then The beauty of if you do get a critical mass in that community is the community will probably start telling us what they want to see and how they would like it to evolve. And if we can then see that there is a high level of interest in going down a certain path, we might actually embrace that path. So they don't have to rely on my good ideas. There might be 10,000 good ideas out there that we can then look to sort of bring together, assess, and execute. So it's probably a non-committal answer, Drew, but it's probably one that you're expecting, which is wait and see. But at least we're in this space, is what we would say, and at least we're willing to learn, which I think is the most important first step for most sporting organisations.
Candidly, I would have been pretty shocked if you said, yes, welcome to the DAO. Here's how you join. And here's your first vote. Figure out what color wicket they're going to use today. As to that question, the term DAO is probably unfamiliar for many in the audience. So very generally, it refers to one of two different things. It can be a legal entity incorporated under the law of a jurisdiction, where those that are managing it are using tools derived from the cryptocurrency world, like wallets, digital assets, smart contracts, in order to manage it. And those from a legal perspective aren't terribly different than every other incorporated entity. You're just using different tools to conduct governance. The type of DAO that our panelists are talking about today are essentially collaborations by individuals, entities, potentially code, in the management of powers over some digital assets. Doesn't require a legal entity, and hypothetically could be eligible or available or opting into or out of certain legal obligations. And the ambiguity as to who the DAO is in that context is somewhat interesting from a regulatory arbitrage perspective. Big topic for another time. But we did actually get a question from the audience, and apologies, Mark, it's a lawyer question. So I'm going to give a US answer, and then I'll ask Abhi potentially to give an Australia answer if he's comfortable with it. The question is, what would happen to NFTs if they're held to be a security and subject to SEC regulation, and is that determination likely or unlikely? I love this question because it gives me an opportunity to talk about digital assets more broadly. A digital asset is not necessarily in and of itself going to fit into any specific regulatory bucket. It is the promises made by the issuer of an instrument that create the legal significance. So if I sell 1,000 tokens and I don't promise anybody anything, it's unlikely that they're a security. If I tell you that these tokens give you the right to vote in the governance of a company, give you an ownership share in the company, and give you the right to dividends, I've just given you equity in a tokenized form. And under US law, if I've given you a token and I said, the money that you give me is going to be used in order to build out a new software system or product in the future, I've probably sold you an investment contract. The token itself might be the exact same one, but it's not clear. So to directly answer the question, there are probably NFTs that have been issued under circumstances where they would likely be considered a security under US law. The issuer said you're going to get a stream of revenue if you buy the NFT, or you're going to be able to access other systems or products of value in a way that most lawyers would consider it to be an NFT, a security. And so the short answer is, in the United States, we rely on a regulator or a law or an appellate court judge to tell us the nature of an instrument. We don't have a pre-approval regime in the United States. So it's likely that some NFTs are probably securities under US law, but it's not entirely clear until a law says so, a regulator says so, or an appellate judge says so. Abhi, to close this out, how would Australian law think about this problem?
Yeah, I must confess, Drew, I don't have a specific answer on the subject matter of the question, but it is definitely an area we broadly had to consider when we entered into our commercial arrangements with our two technology partners. And it's not just limited to the regulatory framework, it's probably also extends to some significant intellectual property considerations when it comes to sort of use of our video footage and use of our still imagery and use of our player likenesses, et cetera. And the most difficult part of it is I think Mark used the term, the immaturity of the technology is probably the biggest challenge when it comes to trying to contract around this. But you add that into the global footprint that we all expect to have with our programs and the way we want to execute our programs, and the muddiness that you sort of just described there, Drew, where there's quite clearly a lot of subjective analysis that goes into somewhat objective questions. So we did not answer all of those questions, but what we did do was de-risk sort of de-risk it from a cricket perspective before we entered into partnership with our tech providers. And part of that was having some fairly frank conversations around, well, here are some of these risks, and here are what we can look to do if some of these risks materialise. And there are no doubt some potential death knells to NFT programs based on how the regulation evolves. But we also think that certainly larger brands are going to have a fairly conservative approach to executing their NFT programs in the early days. That's certainly going to be true of cricket. We're not going to try and upset our regulators when we execute our program, so we'll be pretty within the margins, so to speak. So we have a watching brief, but we have contractual protections built in that consider the need for contingencies or potentially termination if sort of significant adverse regulations apply or significant adverse moves are made in this space.
Wonderful.
Right.
Well, Abhi, Mark, I really appreciate you both joining us. Unfortunately, we've come up against it on time, but this was a great discussion. Appreciate everyone's insights, and goes without saying, good luck to everyone with their NFT programs. And thank you to K&L Gates for hosting this wonderful conversation for us.
It was a pleasure being on. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks, Drew. Thanks, Mark.
Drew, Adi, Mark, thank you so much for the really interesting discussion about NFTs, blockchain, DAOs. I know it's a really hot topic right now, and so we really appreciate all of you sharing your experience and your expertise. It's going to be really interesting to see how this area continues to develop in the world of sports and beyond. All right, so finally now, last but certainly not least, I'm very excited to finish up our Global Sports Law Symposium with a fantastic panel focusing on current issues in sports administration. This panel will be moderated by the one and only Chris Round, who's my co-leader in our firm's Global Sports Industry Group. Chris is a partner in our Melbourne office, where his practice focuses on a wide range of IP issues, from the registration of IP rights to litigation and so forth. Chris also has the honor of being one of the world's preeminent supporters of Collingwood Football Club, who's an Australian rules football club. Go Magpies. And even though he lives in Australia, Chris has attended quite a few US sporting events, including the NFL, NBA, MLB, and NHL games. But given the participants on this next panel, I think we definitely need to get him to a soccer game the next time he comes to the US. So, Chris, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I definitely need to get myself to an MLS game. I try to get to a US sport every time I go over there, but with this panel, I'll get into some soccer. Look, thanks, John. Thanks to the panelists this morning. I've got 4 panelists. Caroline Carnegie, who's the managing director of Melbourne Victory, which is one of the teams in the A-League in Australia, which is the equivalent of the MLS. I have Joe Connaughton, who's the general counsel at Los Angeles Football Club. I have Maya Mendoza Ekstrom, who's the chief operating officer at Seattle Sounders. And I have Garrison Mason, who's the general counsel of the United Soccer League. And Garrison, you currently look like you're in an FBI kind of video. And
I feel like I'm a Bond villain, but continue.
Yeah, look, if you don't wish to show your face on television, that's okay. Look, if this audience this morning has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. We've got a pretty loose structure this morning. I'm happy to try and structure the questions any way possible. I should have really made this discussion current issues in soccer administration. We've gone through our extensive K&L client base and have ended up with 4 lawyers who work for soccer teams or soccer leagues. And given I'm dealing with Australians and US, I'm just going to call it soccer this morning. If any Europeans or UK have a problem with that, you can also hit me up in the chat, but I'm going to call it soccer. Rather than give a long intro to everybody, I'm fascinated as to how 4 lawyers can end up in basically different positions. I've got two GCs, I've got a managing director, and I've got a GC of a league. Caroline, I'll start with you. What was the path you took to end up as the managing director of the Melbourne Victory?
Thanks, Chris, and good morning or good afternoon, everybody, depending on where you are. For me, as you know, Chris, I'm a former colleague of yours, so 17 years at K&L Gates and its predecessor firm in Australia, and about 14 months now as managing director of Victory. I think for me, the path in sports started when I was a lot younger, and I did a long time with North Melbourne Football Club, which is an AFL club in Australia, for those that don't know, sort of helping out on the side and running some corporate coterie group networks for them, which sort of led me into having a sports practice as well as part of my sort of private M&A that I was doing at K&L Gates. And from there, I started advising Melbourne Victory from a legal perspective, and then I was invited to join as company secretary and then a board member, and I served in those roles for about 7 years before taking on the MD position. We had a sort of a vacancy and a change of path required. We finished bottom, not last season, the season before, just before I took over, and we had a lot of changes that were required. You know, COVID was a big factor in that and continued to be last season, but they, you know, my co-directors put some faith in me, and I was fortunate enough to land in the role.
Yeah, and we were very sad to lose Caroline, but as a fan of the Melbourne Victory, I'm awfully impressed by what she does, and I'm constantly texting her on the side to congratulate her for the fact that our team has gone from last to basically nearly first. So well done. Joe, what about yourself?
Yeah, so lifelong sports fan. I was an athlete until I was about 18, and I wasn't good enough to be an athlete anymore, and they told me to stop playing. So always had a dream to kind of work in sports, but you know, pipe dream not having been a professional player or coach or agent or something like that. So kind of always kept in the back of my mind. But yeah, out of law school, I started doing M&A and securities work at a large firm in Chicago. After a few years there, made the transition in-house corporate counsel to Groupon, large public company, also based in Chicago, kind of doing the same type of work. And then really kind of got my break in 2018 when I got my first sports experience when I joined the front office of the Oklahoma City Thunder of the NBA. So did a lot of traditional legal work for OKC, also did a good bit of work on the salary cap front, and kind of led various other basketball operations related initiatives. And then in February of this year, actually made the move to LAFC as general counsel.
Right, so we've got two who started in M&A. Maya.
Good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. My story is probably the divergent one here. So, I mean, Seattle is a best known for Starbucks, Amazon, Microsoft out here, but we also have a almost 50-year club at Sounders FC. So we'll celebrate our 50th anniversary as a club in 2024. So it's been an ever-present part of my life since I was born and before I was born. I've been a fan of the club in every iteration. I had the benefit of growing up in a part of the country that produced 4 members of the inaugural 1991 women's national team that went to China and won the first. We won't call it World Cup because FIFA doesn't, but whatever they called it then, the women's championship. But the first one, the first star on our chest. They all hailed from Seattle. So I grew up playing soccer from the time I could walk. My parents started playing co-ed soccer as adults, threw their girls into it, played through college. I did through my coaching badges. I did through my B level in the United States. Coach of the college that I played at, was a professional coach, a director of coaching, all while going through law school and starting a legal practice, and was around the game essentially. My dad was and we'll call this what it is, pro bono general counsel for the Sounders when they were resurrected as an A-League franchise, which is a predecessor league, was a Division 1-ish league, we'll call it, in the USSF in the 90s, that predates MLS. And that was throwing money down a hole of community investment, essentially, in professional soccer at the time. And so my dad had a client who decided to do that for fun as a side project. And so he became the outside general counsel. Stayed on as general counsel for the Sounders from 1994 all the way through the transition in 2008 to MLS. And I started practicing with my dad in 2007. So one of my first projects was doing all of the intellectual property transition and the sort of legacy transition from the old USL entity, Garrison, we remember, all the way to the MLS entity that Adrian, our majority owner, created at that time with his compatriots. So I didn't get the capacity to go in-house right away. The Seattle Seahawks, the NFL team, operated operations on the business side for the team for those first few years. But in 2014, when we separated operations from the Seahawks, and I'd been practicing with my dad for nearly 8 years at that time, Adrian asked if I'd come do some legal work for us, and I said sure. And I had the good fortune of having a good mentor in my father who kicked me out and said, go do that. And I'd been coaching and around the game. Adrian and I had started our charitable arm, the foundation, which became our charitable arm in 2013 in parallel. So it was still doing a lot of work around the franchise, and we had the capacity to come in-house, and have slowly acquired other projects as assigned, including leading the Seattle's World Cup bid, which was just recently successful for 2026. And then taking in all of our social justice, social impact work, and human resources, which we now call people and culture as an organization. And so in this year became chief operating officer, and I'm very quickly transitioning my general counsel role to a associate general counsel that I poached from another organization locally last year. So looking forward to not being a lawyer all of the time, every day anymore.
Excellent. Thank you. And Garrison, welcome. We can now see your face.
Thanks. Thanks for having me. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, everyone. Like Maya, I grew up around sports since I was little. I've been playing soccer since I was about 5 years old. I think my dad coached my first team. I played all the way through college and always wanted to be involved in sports in some capacity. Never actually thought that it was a possibility. Certainly after going to law school and graduating at the time that I did, there were hardly legal jobs for anyone, much less anyone trying to get involved in a sports practice. But for me, how I eventually made my way in was kind of through my wife, who convinced me to move down to Florida to be with her. Her parents moved down here, found a position with a local law firm doing primarily kind of commercial litigation and actually some appellate work, but ended up doing work for the Tampa Bay Rays and doing work for USL over those 3 or 4 years, and ultimately transitioned that into a job with the USL, which was back in 2014. At that point, I took over for the quote unquote general counsel, who at that point did not actually have a bar license, but was as much of a practicing attorney as the company had at that point, back when it was 14 teams or so in the entire kind of ecosystem. And then I've been here for the last 8 years and have seen it kind of and deal with all of the growth that's come along with it. So that's how I made my way in.
Great. I mean, it just sounds like people who have a very strong interest in sport, as I do, kind of find their way into working with sports or for sports. As a sports fan over the last few years, it seems like the sports have had the most tumultuous time because of COVID. To me, it seems like the first time that any sports in my lifetime have shut down, have had these sort of challenges. To me, it sounds like, or looks like from afar, the hardest period that any of us could have faced. Is it the case that that our jobs have become harder in sports as a result of COVID, and how have your jobs changed, and what are those challenges that you faced in 2020, 2021, and how are we going to go forward in 2022? So I thought that was an interesting place to start. I'll start in America, maybe Joe, Maya, with the MLS. It shut down like all the other leagues. And how do we all go?
Yeah, I mean, I think tact I would take is it's not specific to sports. I think that one of the biggest changes, and it kind of remains to be seen whether this is a benefit or a challenge over the past couple of years, is how it's changed the workforce's expectation of kind of what the work week now looks like, right? So like a lot of the companies that survive this thing in sports and outside of sports have now shown they can operate at least a portion of their staff working remotely, some working non-traditional hours, some in very different time zones. So I think there are going to be some benefits to this shift. Obviously, possibly the need for less office space, ability to potentially save some costs there, the ability and option to recruit and maintain staff in other cities. I think that's a new thing too for a lot of companies, sport teams included. But I also think that any organization that kind of relies on a strong and cohesive culture is going to find it tough to maintain that culture if people aren't regularly seeing each other in person, getting lunch, going to coffee, all that kind of good stuff. So it might be a little old school in that way, but I also think it's a little too soon to say whether it's a net impact is positive or negative at this point.
I don't know that our jobs are harder. I think it was hard. Garrison, you and I can laugh at someday we're going to share a beer and we're going to laugh because we were the last game I think that got played in the USL with our second team, and we played behind closed doors against Landon Donovan San Diego team, and it was literally a Tuesday night game. And as the teams were warming up, it was when the NBA shut down. It was when that game was happening and the NBA shut down, and we were like, thank God we don't have fans here. And it sucked a lot. That's just my technical term for it, because I think as lawyers, what we realized in those moments is everyone was looking to us, and there were literally no answers to any question anyone was asking us, whether it was, what do we do with ticket refunds? How do we safely get our employees somewhere? And we were getting these really perverse right angles. So we'd get a question about an ADA issue, and then you'd realize you're creating a hazardous work environment under OSHA, which are these regulatory regimes in the United States that never interact and intersect that way. So it was constant sort of barrage of not having answers. And as lawyers inside organizations, like that's the voice that we have. So I think it was a really quick transition to the best advice we can give is to be human and to treat people humanly as possible. And outside counsels, no offense to K&L Gates, I'm sure you guys gave great advice, but outside counsels couldn't give us advice. And so we were left sort of onto our own and trying to make really rational decisions in real time. And that was after the league had shut down. So thank God we don't have games and these other things, and everybody's home. And now what? And I think what happened last year is we transitioned to a perpetual state of triage. So there were more answers, more data in the system and more answers, but we were always analyzing every single decision we were making, like in real time on a daily basis. And for Seattle, for example, just given our jurisdiction, I mean, we were ground zero. We were the first cases in the United States. We were one of the last to let go of restrictions. And as Seattle Sounders FC, even with all of the other sports organizations in the marketplace, our fans over the course of the last 2 years went through, I think we counted 17 different regimes with how they come into the stadium, what they do they wear a mask, where do they get to the go, 17 different changes over between when fans were allowed back in spring of 2021 and March of 2022, when the final restrictions from a county regulatory regime were lifted. That's a hell of a lot of communication that can't all be technical and legal and risk management. So I think we found our human voice in that, and that's something for us as an organization that I think has made us stronger. It's deepened our relationship with our fans. We renewed 94% last year of our season tickets, and a lot of it was we did a little bit of data analysis, was this connection. Like people felt like we had their backs, over even with all of the stuff that sucked. Again, technical term. We had their backs. And I do think that's resonant. And I do think gives us more resiliency going forward. I think the other piece that I would say to this group, you guys just had the NFT sort of technology thing. We are light years ahead. Like we made an evolutionary leap in getting our fan base to a technological future that now is super exciting for us, right? We have 4 generations of fans in our building. My mom is one of those generation fans who you can't Google. Like she doesn't have a presence. She doesn't she now uses touchless technology and Apple Pay on her Apple Watch, and it's because of COVID. So how do we exploit that technological literacy amongst every demographic in our fan base that we would not have gotten but for COVID.
Caroline, I think you'd emphasize, having been locked down for 9 months with me in Melbourne, 17 different regimes. It felt like Melbourne Victory was playing at 4 o'clock on a Wednesday and midnight on a Tuesday, and no fans today and fans tomorrow. And
yeah, I think that last year was probably the hardest of the seasons. So the two before were COVID affected, but we were playing behind closed doors for a lot of it. So there was member management, but less fan engagement management. And then when the vaccine regime came in last season, that created a whole heap of additional things that we needed to work through. We had to work through them. You know, in Melbourne, it was mandated for anyone in professional sport to be double vaccinated before they could play. So there was a lot of education around how that needed to work with our teams, and we had the same approach. So not just professional sport, but our academy teams as well. We had a moving fixture, so I think there was over 50% of the fixtures that were set moved last season, and so that impacts our members, our sponsors, our benefits, our players. We were playing 3 games in a week, so there was a lot of logistical difficulties. And even with back on the vaccinations, you had to be vaccinated to come into stadium, and there was a lot of management around our membership with that. So those sorts of things probably created challenges that we're looking forward to getting away from this season, where, in the next few weeks, we should have our season fixture out and we'll be back to what we were 3 years ago, which is this is your season and you know when to turn up. I think the other thing from us, I mean, I agree with Joe. I think the working from home, we need to be flexible or you lose people. It's hard to find people, but it's very difficult in this sort of environment to not be around each other. So we're sort of navigating through that. And I think the other learning from us from an administrative perspective is I think there's been a little bit of a shift in how people perhaps consume their sport. I think there's been 2 years, maybe 3 of apathy where they might have paid, but they're sitting at home on the couch watching it. And so their incentive they're sort of out of the habit of getting along to the games. And we want membership and you want to retain that, but we also want people showing up so that it's a great atmosphere and other people want to come. We build our brand, we build the game, and we build broadcast. And I think for us, we're certainly approaching this season perhaps differently to what we've done in the past, which is a lot more about how do we get those people in, which means we're not just putting on a game, we're actually putting on entertainment every week. So it's got to go well beyond the game, because we're sort of seeing patterns that people will go to events. But, when you've got 13 home games in a season, perhaps they're not special enough to get them along to it. So from a purely administrative perspective, we're challenging ourselves to do things a little bit differently, but I'm not sure, you're doing that anyway. It's just a slightly different emphasis perhaps coming out of COVID than we might have otherwise had with some of those things. So there's been, I think, I don't know whether it's necessarily harder moving forward. Last year was very difficult for all of those reasons, but there's new challenges as a result of it.
Garrison, being the GC of a whole league or set of leagues, similar experience for you?
I would say there was definitely a lot more work. So when COVID hit, yes, as Maya said, it was a giant question mark as to what everyone should be doing, and there wasn't any clear direction given from anyone, I think. But you can always look to leaders in the area, listen, in the USA at that point, the NBA was kind of leading the show as to the response that was appropriate, and that kind of flowed down to the rest of the league. So I think a lot of our role was kind of making sure that we were acting as leagues should and taking guidance from those with the know-how and the expertise to be able to make these sorts of decisions, and finding experts and others who could help us along those paths, which I think we did a decent job with. And then, the other, and then I guess from there it was actually the process of getting all of the clubs in line to follow a specific set of protocols and regimes and so on, which was necessary and useful and so on. It was also a challenge, right, to actually put those in place. It was something brand new and something that we had to learn about very much on the fly at a level of sophistication where we could actually advise the clubs appropriately, which is what lawyers always do, right? We're supposed to become experts on a particular subject in about a week, but it was a challenge, and then kind of the implementation and follow-up. It's obviously been a few years now. I'm certainly looking forward to the hopefully not too distant future when we no longer have COVID protocols in place that we have to monitor each club and make sure they're complying with them and so on. But the other thing I would say is that the COVID also provided an opportunity for all of the council in their respective kind of fields to step up and be leaders, right? They were the people that their organizations were looking to, both kind of how, on the field and from an operational perspective. And, as Joe mentioned, in the actual kind of business, the day-to-day business of the companies, which when people talk about sports, they kind of think the stadium and the field and how the players interact and get from game to game. They don't think about the fact that teams also have offices and staff, and they have all of the same challenges that everyone else has, but it was an opportunity for a lot of us as well. So looking forward to it hopefully dissipating, but that was my takeaway.
So Garrison, you've led me into the next question. When we joined K&L Gates, I kept hearing the question, what keeps you up at night, being asked on panels. And I always thought that's a very interesting question. And I thought I'd never ask that question. But, post-COVID, Garrison, you've led me into the question, okay, if COVID is done, as sports administrators, what are the issues that you're next worried about? What are the things keeping you up at night? Is it the after effects of COVID, or is it something totally different? What do we think we're going to be worried about in 2022, 2023, 2024? Caroline?
I think for me, I don't know whether it keeps me up at night. I'm probably, quite relaxed enough to know there's always going to be things that need to be done. So we'll just, deal with them as they come about. I think for me, from a sports perspective, what COVID probably highlighted is, and one of the things that happened was, additional cost layers upon layers we certainly had in Australia. Our players and our staff were rapid testing every day, and, huge expenses. And it also showed that we really need to look at how we can diversify, I think, some of the things that we do, so that we're not, there's always been an up and a down and a natural that flows with that, depending on how successful you are. But when you get hit by a bomb like COVID, every element of your regular business in terms of membership and sponsorship and players and engagement are all hit. So for me, it's really, how do we take our club to the next level to try to future-proof, and hopefully we never have these sorts of issues again, but to try to future-proof disasters. So whether it's because you're not performing as well on the pitch because it's COVID, some other regulatory matter that might interrupt how we do our business as usual, how can we expand our business as usual so that we're positioning ourselves to not perhaps suffer the way that I think a lot of sports have over the last 3 years. And I think it will take a while for them to recover back to the position they're in. So that's the big one on my agenda.
Chris, we couldn't hear you.
Oh, I just was trying to throw to whoever wanted to go next.
Go for it, Maya.
Keeps you up at night. Everything that went on pause because of COVID. I think we're still in the midst in the United States, and I'm sure, globally, data privacy and being ripe for be taken hostage. Those are issues that are prescient, and we're in transition to ensure that that we're steadfast in those things. There are massive changes in the content distribution landscape. All of us in the United States have been subjected to copyright trolls in a music licensing ecosystem, and so again, it's those kinds of systems and regimes that have us thinking about thinking about sort of those business applications as we think about diversifying our portfolios so that we are more resilient, because maybe I'm Debbie Downer, Caroline, but I think to myself that we have to assume that another one is coming. And so if we're going to be in a content mode and a content creation space, we better be real darn sophisticated about all of those things. That keeps me up at night. And I think this people thing keeps me up at night, right? I think there's a massive transition happening in our industry, in terms of, at least in Seattle, in terms of the people we have relied upon. Another venue came to Seattle, Climate Pledge Arena, NHL Kraken. NBA will eventually come back, and we're getting all of our stuff back from Oklahoma City that they call the Sonics, but really belongs in Seattle. But NBA will eventually come back. We have a massive new convention center that's opening up. So the older folks retirees who've staffed our events for years, who are phenomenal, aren't coming back after COVID. The teachers who used to work in the summertime to support events can't support that many events in our industry. The type of job in our market, right? The minimum wage in our market for a base level, entry level position is above $22 an hour now, because Climate Pledge Arena has set the bar really high. So we're talking about an industry that has fundamentally changed and is changing, and all those expense layers that Caroline was talking about added to just some market dynamics here for us. Right. Those are all the things that keep us up at night, and soccer's still a growing sport. And so while we have those challenges, we've also got this incredible brass ring in 2026 that is, if we can't like catapult ourselves through the next 4 years, then we will have failed. And that keeps me up at night too, is making sure that while we're trying to increase our show rate back to what it was in 2019, because I agree people are accustomed to sitting on their couches now, while we're trying to make sure that we diversify our revenue channels on a year-over-year basis from a revenue perspective, that we can still keep our head up long enough to capitalize on the growth opportunity that's in front of us over the next 5 years.
That's about 15 things, so I'm not sure you ever sleep. Joe?
Yeah. So along with running an MLS team, we also own our own stadium in Los Angeles. So should first say that our stadium ops staff, event staff, they're awesome. Could not be more impressed with the small group of people, limited resources, who can turn a stadium from a soccer venue one night to a concert venue the next, then back to a soccer stadium. And they do this over and over again. They do it incredibly well. They do it on a pretty tight budget. That being said, the thing that kind of keeps me up at night is just the sheer amount of people that we have coming through our stadium in a given year. So between MLS games, NWSL games, 20 to 30 concerts per year, festivals, international soccer friendlies, literally hundreds of small events, we have approximately 1 million people coming through our doors over the course of a 12-month period. So it's one of the busier stadiums in the country, soccer stadiums for sure. And we go above and beyond best practices, but no matter how safe you are with that many people coming in, drinking, partying, having fun, cheering, it's just impossible to completely mitigate the risk. So that's definitely what keeps me up.
I mean, I'm always surprised when I see, like Madison Square Garden's basketball one night, it's ice hockey the next, it's basketball the next. It does seem like a ridiculous way to run your event, to have the whole thing change every night. But yeah. Garrison, what about yourself? In the league perspective.
It's an excellent question, and I've been trying to come up with a good answer as I've been sitting here, and I don't have a great one yet. But I think the what keeps me up is the clubs, essentially. The fact that despite despite the fact that we do as best we can to understand kind of exactly where they are at any given moment and what their intentions are and so on, we never really know what's about to pop up, particularly at our level, right? It's not we don't have the staff or the resources to be able to monitor the clubs the way that more sophisticated kind of major league sports do, and so we always have issues pop up out of nowhere that hadn't been expected, which people are then looking to the legal department to either fix, or are wondering why we didn't spot this thing that no one could have ever spotted. So that's what keeps me up at night, is essentially the unknown of and I would also say that I think there have been a lot of clubs that have been intent on investment in a number of different areas, and with the kind of economy being what it is at the moment, I don't know whether all of those projects and other things are going to come to fruition as we had planned, and so making sure that we are actually aware of kind of how those projects have changed and what their intentions are and so on. And that's what keeps me up at night.
Yeah. Yeah, I can imagine that the clubs all have a very different way of looking at things. We've got 10 minutes to go, so I'm just going to bounce out some quick questions, and whoever wants to answer. These are more fan-based questions. So we've had like EPL clubs come to our countries. I noticed my EPL team, Arsenal, was in the States. Last Friday night, I went and watched Manchester United play Melbourne Victory. 75,000 people turned up to a game where I felt like 74,000 of them, Caroline, were barracking for Manchester United. As US and Australian teams, we're kind of we become the Washington Generals to these bigger clubs coming to our shores, and we play them. Caroline, do we get any actual benefit out of that, or are we just there to lose and to lose gracefully? What is the benefit when the big club comes to play us?
We're definitely not there to lose. We don't go into any game to lose, just to be clear, Chris. I think there's a whole myriad of benefits which are separate to financial as well for us. So, Manchester United coming out here was very much the Manchester United tour, and we were happy to be a part of that. But as Maya said before, football isn't the predominant, or soccer isn't the predominant sport in Australia. So any opportunity that we have to elevate the game in front of people is an amazing opportunity that we need to make the most of. I mean, we had 75 odd thousand there. It was similar, if not a bit more, last night when Manchester United and Crystal Palace played. We don't get those crowds to A-League soccer games. And so what we need to do is have matches of that ilk that showcase football in this country to help drive and benefit our league. So I think there's an enormous amount of benefit to us doing that. And then it's just up to the league and the clubs now to try to maximise off those opportunities to build into our own seasons.
And I don't know the answer to this, Joe or Maya, but have your clubs been part of these, pre-season tours? And maybe not.
So we've not hosted anyone since I've been here. We've hosted other games, but there is a real appetite for European soccer here. I mean, there's a weird anecdote. There's a mall near me in LA with an entire store dedicated to a French team, Paris Saint-Germain. So it's very weird. They only sell PSG gear, memorabilia. So while I'd obviously love that to be a full store dedicated to LAFC gear, I think it's probably easier to convert PSG fans to LAFC fans than maybe someone who's a fan of another sport and doesn't care about soccer at all. So I tend to think anything that helps to grow the sport of soccer in the US is a positive thing for us and the MLS as a whole. I think we can also learn a lot from other teams. They've been around a lot longer. So how they handle their football ops, how they handle their business ops, I think we have room to learn from them. So I see it as a positive, net positive.
We used to. So prior to joining the MLS, we hosted some of the Champions League series that would come over here in the summer. Those were some of the first massive events. We put 65,000 in Lumen Field, and it was awesome. In 2009, 10, 11, 12, we included a mid-season friendly, Barcelona, Chelsea, Manchester United. We played them all against our Sounders team. What we've learned is that two things for Sounders FC. One, our market, our fans, maybe disproportionately so than other MLS markets, are Sounders fans that want to buy tickets from us. So as we have become more sophisticated in MLS, that is not a benefit to our fans anymore to have a mid-season fixture with Sounders FC. The amount of work to put on that match for our staff is also not worth the squeeze in a market in the summertime in Seattle, where it's one of the more beautiful places to be, doing multiple things. And so the cost analysis of it has shifted in our sort of 15 years of existence. The other thing that's interesting for us as a fans, as we look at that too, is MLS has fundamentally changed in terms of the fixtures and the competitions. And next summer, we will add, for the first time ever, Leagues Cup. So our league will shut down, and every MLS team will play every Liga MX team in a massive tournament in the month of August, and then we'll restart league again. And so fixture congestion and competitions between Champions League, US Open Cup, now Leagues Cup, and MLS have created a inability for our first team to really find time in our summertime calendar to play that game. And as a result, we've now looked south. So we actually have a partnership with Orleg Esports, which owns 2 Liga MX teams. And that's our international partnership. And so we started it last year during COVID. We haven't been, it's a marketing relationship. It's a development relationship. It's our owners are friends relationship. We ended up playing one of those teams in Leagues Cup last, or in Campeones Cup. I can't even remember which competition last year. And it's a lot of fun to look south. So you'll see that coming out of MLS is the closer coordination between League MX and MLS, especially as we get into 2026. I keep saying that, but it's like the thing that's in the front view of my mind right now. So.
Yeah, so the FIFA World Cup coming to the US in 2026, it's coming, the Women's World Cup is coming to Australia and New Zealand in the summer of 2023, the northern winter. And the Men's World Cup is coming to Qatar starting in November. They originally were supposed to host it in their summer, but clearly because it's a furnace, they've moved it to their winter. How is that? How are those changes going to impact you guys as administrators? I think, Caroline, is our league going to shut down, or is it just going to go through the World Cup? What are we doing?
It hasn't been released yet, Chris, but I think there's a very strong possibility that the league will shut down.
The MLS will already be in its hiatus period, correct? Yeah.
That's correct. Yeah, the MLS Cup is November 5th this year.
Right, and the World Cup starts on the 21st. Mm-hmm. And does the Women's World Cup, Caroline, compete with the A-League next year, or is that also going to be?
It'll be out of season. It's a similar time period. It's July, August next year, so it'll be in the lead into both the men's and the women's seasons.
Great. Okay.
Which is great. Yeah.
Well, it's great. It's going to be a real boon for football in our country. And then I expect that with the way the US, the Canadian, and the Mexican bid has structured itself, that soccer should see a massive benefit in the next 4 years, and really be able to compete with those other US sports. Look, I could talk sport pretty much all day, but I think we need to wrap it up. Thank you so much to the 4 of you for giving up your time this morning and this afternoon. And good luck to all your teams in the coming weeks and seasons. Garrison, good luck to your whole league. Hopefully,
appreciate it.
Hopefully, none of the clubs do anything that makes you too stressed. Look, I'm not sure if John's coming back, but it's been a great 3 hours of discussion, and we really appreciate not only the 4 panelists I've got with me, but everyone else who was participating. And well, here he is. He's back.
I couldn't have said it any better. You're wrapping.
Oh, thank you.
So yeah, no, that's wonderful.
Yeah, it's been a great experience. I think we're going to have a recording, John, of 3 of the panels, which will be on our website. But otherwise, I just want to thank everyone for their attendance and for listening in.
Thanks.
Thank you for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed the content and that you'll reach out to our panelists with any questions you may have. This concludes today's program. Have a great day, and you may now disconnect.